Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Cadet Dowdy. I'm going to be doing a quick presentation on the civilian-military disconnect today. So just to go over a few disclaimers here. I'm going to be addressing some serious issues, including PTSD and mental health. I'm in no way a mental health expert or subject matter expert on this, so I rely on the advice of experts. I'm simply passing on their advice and their work to you. I won't delve super deep into a lot of these issues, just because, again, I am not an expert on the subject, but they are certainly a part of what we'll be discussing today. A little bit about me. As of this recording, I'm currently finishing Army ROTC. I have not yet served in any active duty capacity, no combat experience. I've gone through Army training and been ROTC for the last 4.5 years. And so I have experience in the Army as far as knowing the terminology and being around the environment, but again, have not been on active duty. Commissioned on the 21st of November as a second lieutenant into the active duty. This presentation in no way expresses the views or represents the Army. These are my personal research and discussion on the subject. So goals for today. This is primarily pointed towards civilians, distilling the work of many experts on this subject, helping better understand the military and its members. I want to help people be able to talk to and relate to military members and veterans, and just ultimately help bridge the civilian and military gap and be more aware of it. So let's define it. Comes straight from the DoD. This disconnect is characterized by misperceptions, a lack of knowledge, and an inability to identify those who serve. That is what the disconnect is. Go over a brief history of it. So since Vietnam, we've been an all-volunteer force. There has been no draft needed since Vietnam. We also haven't really had an all-out war like we did in World War I, World War II. None of us have had to deal with war rations, government taking over industry, affecting production, that sort of thing. Also, this is a map, just general of U.S. Displacement. This is kind of where the major Army bases are. And you can see there's a bit of a concentration in the south, southeast to be specific. It's become more and more secular, and just a general lack of connection with the population. Really, if you don't live near town or know someone in the military, because we're not affecting day-to-day life and we're not having a draft, people have very little connection with the military. This is represented in our elected officials as well. This here is a percentage mark on the percentage of officials in Congress that have any military service. In 1977, 77% of the House and Senate had served in the armed forces. Today, only about 20% of officials in Congress have any military experience, and most of those are older from this kind of previous generation where military service was much more commonplace in elected officials. Some stats to go over. Currently, there's 1.4 million members serving active duty in the military. That's about 0.4% of our population. In Vietnam, there's about 9 million, and we're on active duty, 4.5% of our population. And in World War II, 12.2 million, that was 12% of our population. So the rate has definitely been on the decline. The VA estimates about 22 million veterans are currently alive in the U.S. That's about 7.3% of the population, and that includes anyone who has or is currently serving. So how did this start? As less and less percentage of the population has been part of the service, we also have a smaller army. This also is seen in a concentrated service in families. This has created almost what many experts call a warrior caste, similar to what we saw way back in the day in Sparta and that kind of, Greek legionnaires. 80% of all new recruits have family that have served in the military. It is the singular strongest predictor of military service is whether you have a member of your family. And this just means that the service is being concentrated more and more into individual families and within their own ranks. And that means we're affecting, less and less of the day-to-day population. This also kind of goes back to the map I showed earlier, shows that there's a much higher concentration of service in the South. Again, more secular military where those bases are. So that's your main other exposure to the military, is whether you live near a base. And you can see that reflected in this map. So why does this disconnect between the civilians and military matter? I think it matters primarily on three fronts. We'll talk about them today. First is civilians. It just inability or ability to connect with your friends and family, your ability to help someone with mental issues or transitioning out, understanding better the people that serve them, even if they're not, your friends or family, and just being an informed citizen, help with policy and voting. We'll kind of dive into each of these. Next, I'm not going to go super heavy on. It's the DoD. None of us are probably part of the DoD, so it doesn't have a big effect, but it does show that they have a stake in this claim. It increases stress on veterans, which means their VA system is more strained. If the only people that veterans can talk to are medical professionals provided by the VA, and every single veteran is trying to get that help, it's going to put a lot of pressure on that. And, if they can't talk things out for more minor stuff or just as part of that treatment, it's going to cause issues. The VA or the DoD also sees this issue with recruitment. A lot of officials think that this is one of the main reasons we have a recruitment crisis within most of the military. For veterans, this just more people to talk to about their service, heal, allows them to be better understood, and it's just easier for them to transition out. And we'll kind of dive into the many facets of that right now. So veterans, one thing, we put a lot of money and resources into prep veterans for combat and to do their job, but very little to adapt back to the civilian world. The systems they have, finally check the boxes, kind of get out. I'm looking to get out. I need to take some online classes, and don't put a lot of training on the front end of how to deal with a lot of the emotional things and kind of training to come home. And expert, Hector Garcia, we're going to watch a quick video on that in just a second. Also, it's just difficult for people to talk with them about their experiences who aren't familiar. For this, I speak on personal experience, not because I've gone through combat and had to talk to people, but the other end. Veterans hear that I'm in ROTC or about to go active duty, and they perk up and they want to talk about, the Army, their experience, what they've gone to, share what they've been and done. I've had friends' parents come and talk to me, and in 30 minutes, I'll learn more about that individual's career than their kids knew from 18 years of living with them. And it just goes to show, that big barrier to kind of talk and have that language barrier bridge. Another big one for veterans is just lacking professional resources, transitioning out, kind of, getting civilian jobs, working through that, and that kind of, jobs are pretty essential. You're out of the military, you don't have a job anymore, you need a civilian job to make that transition. And a lot of jobs in the military really do apply to the civilian workforce almost directly, and everyone else indirectly. But veterans have a tough time kind of transitioning that, selling themselves, and employers don't really know what to recruit or what to look for. But most of the military is logistics, is support, is all these things that directly translate to the civilian world, but employers just aren't really aware of that, and veterans don't really know how to communicate, what matters to them and what doesn't. This here is a video by Hector Garcia. I'm just going to watch a minute or two of it. I think he puts things in words much better than I, and then we'll move on.
Objectively, repeatedly, which treatments actually get rid of symptoms and which do not. Now, as it turns out, the best treatments for PTSD use many of the very same training principles that the military uses in preparing its trainees for war. Now, making war, this is something that we're good at. We humans have been making war since before we were even fully human. And since then, we have gone from using stone and sinew to developing the most sophisticated and devastating weapon systems imaginable. And to enable our warriors to use these weapons, we employ the most cutting-edge training methods. We are good at making war. And we are good at training our warriors to fight. Yet when we consider the experience of the modern day combat veteran, we begin to see that we have not been as good at preparing them to come home. Why is that? Well, our ancestors lived immersed in conflict, and they fought right where they lived. So until only very recently in our evolutionary history, there was hardly a need to learn how to come home from war because we never really did. But thankfully today, most of humanity lives in far more peaceful societies. And when there is conflict, we, especially in the United States, now have the technology to put our warriors through advanced training, drop them into fight anywhere on the globe. And when they're done, jet them back to peacetime suburbia. But just imagine for a moment what this must feel like. I've spoken with veterans who told me that one day they're in a brutal firefight in Afghanistan where they saw carnage and death. And just 3 days later, they found themselves toting an ice chest to their kid's soccer game.
Awesome. I'd love to watch all of that video. We don't have much time. I'll be sure to include the title of that along with a few others I'd love for you guys to check out. If you couldn't hear that on the video, please just pull that up. Hector Garcia, it's a TED Talk on YouTube or TED Talk's website. We're going to move on from here. Quick highlight on some of the interviews that I talked to for veterans on this study. I want to focus today on Staff Sergeant Cole. He served about 10 years in the Army, mostly with the 2nd Ranger Battalion. A little bit about him. He grew up in a military town, Colorado Springs, Colorado. He's got Fort Carson Air Force Base, Air Force Academy, Peterson Air Force Base, Schriever Air Force Base, as well as NORAD Central Command. He didn't have any family personally. He had some distant relatives, some uncles, some grandparents, that kind of thing, but not a big connection through family. He didn't love growing up in a military town, but he certainly had that exposure to it. While he was in kind of talking about mental health with him, he definitely saw a lot of that drive on mentality. You know, you're in combat, you're kind of dealing with stuff, something emotional comes up, you got to kind of put it in the back pocket and move on. There's a mission at hand, kind of got to go forward, which, you know, he said works great for the moment, and he saw a lot of people dealing with those repercussions later. And so this last couple of years, he did see a slow culture change, kind of moving the other way, where soldiers and individuals were a little bit more willing to seek out medical attention. Said before, a lot of them were scared, you know, if I seek out medical attention, I'm going to get pulled from my unit, which might be the best thing for me, but it feels like I'm abandoning my fellow soldiers and the people I work with. So for him, he just got out in June. He is a student here at MSU. It's his first semester here. He did take a big initiative to find resources. He said, you know, a lot of resources out there. There's a few provided by the government, but they're really lacking. And so NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have kind of stepped in and given opportunities. I don't know if you guys know this, but Bozeman is a bit of a hotspot for veterans, especially in the SOF community. That's the Special Operation Forces community. And so he kind of saw that out here. There's organizations like Big Sky Bravery is a big one. And so that's one big reason that he moved to Bozeman. He said for a lot of other people, he thinks it's difficult to get out because, you know, it is an adjustment and you have to change and grow a lot, especially, you know, just on yourself, which is just difficult for everyone to come to make that big of an adjustment. For him personally, the biggest adjustments getting out was working with women. He worked in a combat unit and didn't really have any women working closely with him. Women weren't allowed in combat units just up until a few years ago. And so he didn't see that much. You know, they were in the logistical support elements, but he didn't work much one-on-one. Another big one is finding meaning. You know, day to day, your tasks and missions are set out a lot more clear. You know, if you're part of something bigger, and it makes, you know, in the civilian world transition a little bit more fuzzy and gray area. Another big one kind of with that was filling the exciting gap. You know, combat, he said, can be a lot of things and very bad, but you can't deny that it is exciting. Your adrenaline's pumping and kind of coming back, and civilian life almost feeling dull after that. The biggest differences he saw in the two worlds, civilian world, just more emotional. He said this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly a big adjustment for him. Just more emotions being out front, being expressed, but you just don't have that kill or be killed mentality, where the stakes aren't as high. You're not worried about dying over a decision, and it is just a big difference for him. He said he really can only talk with other veterans when about his experiences, but he doesn't really love the community. He thinks a lot of them are kind of stuck in the past, need to move on. This is, of course, his personal opinion, and he thinks that they need to adjust a little bit more. He definitely feels a very instant connection with a lot of veterans. He remembers he was driving his mom's car, which had a Ranger sticker on the back, and a veteran pulled him over, had him in the service for 20 plus years, and just an instant connection. They were able to sit down, a cup of coffee, and kind of catch up and just automatically have that connection. He does think for civilians, though, there's just a huge barrier, and a lot of that comes to a very unique language. They don't know it. You lose a lot of acronyms, very specific words, and it's just a very unique experience that's hard to translate into civilian terms that people would understand. But he does feel like a lot of civilians, they don't know how to have a conversation or feel very nervous that they're going to step on sort of a landmine in the conversation. And he thinks some of this is attributed to like bad veterans, kind of given a bad reputation and maybe getting on a civilian's case when they're just trying to have a conversation, trying to learn a little bit more. And he thinks, both sides could definitely help in that aspect. I asked him, how can we best bridge this gap? And he said, for veterans, you got to be willing to learn and grow. You're adjusting to this new world. This world's not going to adjust to you. You need to make, those changes about yourself. You can't expect everyone else to. For civilians, ask if you care. Don't be scared to have that conversation. It's better to misstep, in his opinion, than not have that conversation at all. But just, do you genuinely care? If you don't, don't humor either of us. Talk about some mental health issues. Currently, the veteran suicide rate is about 17 veterans commit suicide per day. That's average over the last decade. It's about 1.5 times the rate of the general population adjusted for age and sex. These stats include all veterans from Vietnam, World War II era up until modern day. Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, 11 to 20% of veterans per year have been diagnosed with PTSD. Long term, looking at Vietnam veterans, 30 out of every 100 have been diagnosed with PTSD at some point in their lives. A lot of this mental health experts attribute to kind of talking with loved ones and that inability to share. Another big one for veterans is getting work. Veterans, I talked on this earlier, really tough time translating their jobs in the military to employers. They don't really know what they bring to a table. Throwing a grenade or shooting a rifle probably doesn't translate to a lot of civilian jobs, but the leadership, the, material and equipment control and other aspects, maybe job specific, do translate especially. But employers just don't really know the diversity of the military and the wide range. They just see everybody as kind of, trigger pullers and not a lot to offer is often what veterans say. The veterans just have a hard time kind of leveraging their skills to get jobs. One sector in the civilian world that has done I think is a pretty good example is the communications and technology sector. They're very well aware of certain members of the military do a really good job and have a lot of training on expert and cutting edge technology. In the Army specifically, there's the signal branch, which is known to be employed very well post because that civilian sector is aware, how good they're trained on this stuff. And so they hire very heavily. And I think it's a great example. As a civilian, you look, all right, I work here, I'm an employer. What sector of the military, what branch, what job, jobs within the military get a classification called MOS. And it's just your specific job within the military. What MOS is, what jobs in the military translate to my own personal civilian work. So I interviewed about 30 to 40 veterans here on campus, all through the vet center here. I'll talk a little bit more on what they do later, but dive into their responses. So ask them about the family they had in the military. Vast majority said they had family that served. Less than 20% had no family. I also talked with them, how much and how comfortable are they talking with civilians? And just over 50% said they sometimes talk with civilians. Everybody else, just about everyone else, said rarely to never. And those sometimes were very surface level, like, oh, I was stationed here. This was my general job. And they kind of found that was the end of the conversation. It's very difficult. I also, just asked with this question about the existence of the gap, and not a single veteran said that there wasn't at least a significant gap between the civilian and military world and the rest. The other half said there was at least a very large one. I also asked them about the post-services resources they got. 50% said that they were satisfied. This does come from people who have been connected with the Vet Center, so it might be a little bit skewed, but they said that 50% said they were satisfied. The rest said they were very much not. So it kind of sounded like, from what I talked to, you either find connections, find some resource, or you don't. I also discussed this, one of the most surprising parts for me doing this research. Who does bridging this gap primarily fall on? And vast majority said that it was either mainly vets or equal parts. And this was, I think it helps take that load off a little bit as a civilian, where you guys can kind of, it's good to know and it's good to help yourself. But veterans definitely have a big goal kind of adjusting to this new world. I also asked them, what they thought veterans could do. And they said, just explain ourselves, open up. Another interesting point I heard was maintain civilian friendships while you're in. Really easy to just get very secular and just have, your very close friends in the military. But kind of having that outside connection was a big help for some of them transitioning out. Connect with other vets. This all comes without saying. These veterans have all found each other in their group, but find your group. It might be a group in the outdoors. It might be a group looking, for a job. Students connecting like them. Another great point I thought these veterans brought up was ditching the God complex. It's really easy to accept this God status that the society has kind of given our military veterans, but they said it comes with a lot of issues. If you're viewed as perfect, if you're viewed as you can't do any wrong, it's really hard to admit when you need help or when you need, something that you're not perfect. Kind of stepping down off that is pretty tough. And, they said they're not better than civilians and they need to be held to that standard. And for transitioning out, they said just take initiative, find the resources that work for you or that you need. I also asked them, I want to put this up there, what can civilians do? And I think this is a great part for you guys to kind of take note. I said, don't treat us like we're still in. We're civilians now, we need to adjust. But while we're amongst ourselves, let us be each other. Veterans are known to have unique senses of humor that may not translate into the civilian world. They said, if it's an inappropriate environment, by all means, it's unprofessional, but when they're amongst themselves, kind of let them, keep their humor and connect with each other. Just learn more the best you can as a civilian, educate yourself on the subject, figure out, I'm glad you guys are watching this video, helps you a little bit. I want to give you more resources if you are so motivated to educate yourself a little bit more. Same thing with the God complex. Don't put them on a pedestal. They're different people. It's not an excuse. Gone through different experiences, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to live in the same world. Another interesting one I thought about, I'll talk a little bit more on, is holding politicians accountable. Veteran issues just aren't often on the forefront of voters' minds. A lot of lip service, holding our politicians accountable for what they do. If you're an employer, know more about the military. I kind of talked on this at length, but just educate yourself on what works for you. And then just listen. If you want to have a conversation about their service, listen up, open up. Don't ask inappropriate questions. I'll touch on those in just a few minutes. I also asked them, what has most affected their transition? And every single veteran I talked to said that they didn't connect well, they didn't relate, they felt distance, or some other combination of that. And I thought that, that was really telling how big this gap can sometimes feel. Like Sasson and Cole earlier, they talked about, just the lower stakes that they felt at hand in the civilian world, communicating with hiring and employing and finding those resources. So I'm going to touch on the DoD real quick. I'm not going to go at length. There's some parts that I want to focus on a little bit more. But the DoD, most officials and top brass attribute to this gap as part of their big recruitment issues. It's also just helps with their public support, recognition and awareness of deployed troops and armed conflict is very low. Civilians don't really know where we're actively engaged, especially in this long drawn out war. I'll touch on that even more in just a second. The DoD has started a program called Know Your Mill. This is kind of their program to counteract this gap. It's primarily highlights people in the military, what they do, who they are, that kind of thing, and more just puts a face to the big name and to the big army. So policy, this one kind of bleeds from DoD over to the civilian world. And so, we're often very unaware because the war and our conflict isn't affecting our day-to-day life. So we have no idea the rate in which we're deploying troops. We're disconnected from the demands of our policy. And it's just, it doesn't care as much. And a lot of political scientists have nicknamed this the not your son or daughter. And because we're getting so secular, because the same families are bearing the burden of the military and combat, elected officials, civilians, it's not my son or daughter, so I shouldn't, politicians are more apt to deploy troops to go into combat zones because it's not their kids and it's not their friends' kids that are going to fighting these wars. Military issues just often are not on the forefront of voter minds because you don't have much of a connection with it. A lot of lip service from politicians. For the veterans, it's a big talking point, and then often just see that kind of melt away. Military policy is often dictated less by people nowadays and more by lobbying, and that just has to do with voter interest. So, talking about civilians, what can you do, and where does it lie on your shoulders? And I think it's important. It's not all on you, but you can certainly help by understanding a little bit more and kind of having those conversations. No matter your politics, the military is serving all citizens in the U.S. If you have an issue with the military or what they're doing, I think it's really important to remember the military is a civilian-run organization. It's run by a civilian government. We carry out our orders from whatever the civilian government tells us to do. Our job is just to complete those orders and those missions the best we can. So if you have an issue, vote to change it and be politically active to steer. If you want the military to be doing something else, that's in your power as a voter to do that. The military is just less obvious. It's really easy to avoid, ignore as a day-to-day civilian. And I think that's important to kind of remember that, if you don't actively think about it, it's not going to affect your life much, but it is certainly, serving for you. Bridging this gap, will help you relate better with veterans, help them ease their transition going out, but also just showing people that you care about what they did or what they're doing. Currently, we're in one of the longest wars with some of the least interests. Are by far and away Afghanistan, our longest active conflict. Our deployment rates have been through the roofs. People are getting 6, 7, 8 deployments, unheard of numbers in previous generations. In Vietnam, World War II, this just otherworldly to have that many. But that's just because it's a smaller percent fighting. And so we have those same troops going day and day and year and deployment, kind of back to the same thing. But again, this war doesn't affect our day-to-day. We're lucky enough to be able to keep living a pretty normal life, minus maybe some extra screening at TSA. But we're not in all-out war. It's not, affecting that. And we're lucky to have that, but with that luck, it leads to sometimes a lack of recognition or a lack of awareness. But it's very easy to forget we've been in conflict for the last 20 plus years. So those inappropriate questions I talked about earlier, the big three that the veterans often told me about were, did you kill anyone? Did you know anyone that died? And just touching mental health issue subjects. And I think it's important. I'm going to, those are those right out the gate. And then we're going to talk about talking with veterans. And so, like any conversation, like any relationship, you need to build it up. You can't jump right out of the gun. If one of those inappropriate questions we just talked about, if that's the first thing that you say in that conversation, probably not okay. That's just wildly inappropriate to kind of come out of the gate and have that conversation. You need to build up a relationship. If you're a friend, family, coworker, whatever, maybe it's your spouse. Maybe after a while, after you build that relationship, you can have those more difficult conversations. But it's just, it's just something that you shouldn't be discussing right off the gate. Do the best to educate yourself. Try the best you can. It's very difficult if you haven't lived in that world, if you haven't experienced that world, or if you haven't had family in that world. But there are ways to try and kind of educate yourself. And just, if you want to have that conversation, genuinely care. And if you don't know much, and you've had a tough time educating yourself, that's fine. Just sit back and listen. Don't try and lead the conversation. Just open up and let them talk to you and ask questions where you want to learn. But I think at the end of the day, the most important one is just genuinely caring about that person and what they did. So talking about universities, here at MSU, we have the Pet Center. Those are where I connect with most of the veterans here. It gives resources to students. It helps with their educational benefits. We also have the ROTC program here. We have the Army ROTC program as well as an Air Force program. These programs are some of the main representations of military on campuses all across the U.S. The DoD has cited that ROTC programs are some of the primary arm that stretches the widest. Those bases are secular, military members and families are secular, but ROTC programs hit every single major university across the country. And so many people, here at MSU, I've talked to friends that the first time they saw anyone in uniform was a cadet on campus. Dressing up on Wednesdays, going to play Armin in the Woods, or whatever the Air Force does with their labs. I'm not too educated on that. But I think that's important to remember, as cadets, they may not have the most experience in the world, but they're at least, have one foot in that door, one foot in that educational department. Your third or fourth year, you've had a lot more experience. You've been able to kind of expose yourself a little bit more. And I try and remind cadets, given this presentation to them slightly different, that you are the main connection for a lot of your friends and for a lot of your classmates. And it's important to remember that. It hasn't always been that way. In the Columbia riots in 1968, during the draft for Vietnam, they kicked out the ROTC program from campus. Shortly after, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, Princeton, and Stanford all followed suit. These are some of the more prestigious colleges. We're losing more connections with that general population, especially that upper middle class and upper class families and students. Most of those reinstated their ROTC program within the next couple decades. Columbia did not reinstate their program until the repealment of Don't Ask, Don't Tell about a decade ago. But today, almost all major universities have some sort of ROTC program or satellite school connecting them. Want to highlight real quick film talking just on the subject. It's not on YouTube. It is on Vimeo, however. It won a couple awards at the GI Film Festival 2013. It does have some dated technology, which is pretty funny, but it does talk exactly what we've been talking on today. It does a much better job than I ever could. Feel free to check that out on Vimeo. The Civilian Military Divide, Bridging the Gap. I recommend. Great educational resource. Even more, some quicker clips that kind of explore other factors that might make it difficult for veterans to come home besides this disconnect, besides this gap. Experiences and education on what they're doing. Feel free to take a picture of this screenshot. I highly recommend. They're only 5 to 15 minutes long. Super interesting. Wes Moore actually came here and talked at MSU for my commencement address my freshman year. He is a veteran. I also want to highlight Sebastian Younger, an amazing war journalist, has seen some crazy stuff and been embedded in some crazy situations through our war on terror, and has done some great documentaries on these. Restrepo and Cornball are two really good documentaries that I recommend checking out. He also has written 2 books. War and Tribe are both very, very good reads and explores, a lot of the factors that make up the psychology of modern day combat, as well as the transition out and PTSD. some resources here. If you guys have any questions on the resources, stats, or just in general on the subject, please email me or give me, a text. Contact me wherever you're watching this. My email is andy.doughty, DOUGHTY.colorado@gmail.com. I'd love to hear you guys' feedback, or if you had any questions or comments on my presentation today. I'll type that out real quick. If you guys have any questions, just Andy, DOUGHTY.colorado@gmail. But thank you so much for listening today. I hope you guys learned something, and have a great day.